Picture this. You're 6 months pregnant, thinking you're living the perfect billionaire wife dream, when you discover red lace underwear in your husband's Tesla underwear that definitely isn't yours. But here's the twist that'll blow your mind. Instead of crying and begging, this woman decides to play the long game. She secretly transfers $5 million, builds a media empire, and orchestrates the most spectacular public takedown in modern history. What started as a cheating scandal at New York Fashion Week became a federal investigation that destroyed a tech billionaire and crowned a new media queen. This isn't just revenge. This is a masterclass in strategic warfare that'll leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, marriage, and justice. The champagne flute trembled in Madison Sterling's manicured fingers as she watched her husband's Instagram story for the third time. There he was, Chase Montgomery, tech billionaire and supposed father-to-be, laughing with a 23-year-old blonde at New York Fashion Week. The woman's hand rested possessively on his arm while cameras flashed around them like lightning in a perfect storm. Madison's other hand instinctively moved to her 6-month pregnant belly. The baby kicked as if sensing her mother's rising fury. She sat in their $30 million Hamptons mansion, surrounded by marble columns and crystal chandeliers that suddenly felt like prison bars. Chase had told her he was attending a boring tech conference in Silicon Valley. Essential networking, he had said, kissing her forehead with practiced affection. The same lips that were now whispering in another woman's ear at the most exclusive fashion event in America. She screenshotted the story before it could disappear, adding it to a folder on her phone labeled Evidence. The folder already contained 47 photos, 12 videos, and countless text message screenshots. Madison Sterling wasn't just a pregnant housewife anymore. She was building a case. Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Brooklyn Hayes. "Girl, I'm seeing Chase all over Fashion Week coverage. Wasn't he supposed to be in California?" Madison typed back quickly, "Change of plans. Business emergency." The lie tasted bitter, even in text form. She had become an expert at covering for her husband's betrayals, protecting the perfect image they had cultivated over 5 years of marriage. The tech power couple, the American dream success story, the billionaire and his beautiful wife expecting their first child. But tonight, as she watched Chase's arm wrap around another woman's waist, something crystallized in Madison's mind. She opened her laptop and navigated to a secure banking portal. Her fingers moved with surprising steadiness as she initiated a wire transfer of $5 million to an account labeled Project Phoenix. The money came from her own trust fund, inherited from the Sterling media dynasty her great-grandfather had built. Chase had always assumed she was financially dependent on him, another misconception that would serve her well in the coming months. Madison closed the laptop and leaned back in the Italian leather chair that Chase had insisted on buying. Their baby girl was due in 3 months. But this child would not be born into a house of lies. Not if Madison had anything to say about it. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she had memorized but never called. "Derek Stone's office," came the crisp voice of a secretary. "This is Madison Sterling. I need to schedule a meeting with Mr. Stone. Tell him it's about the Montgomery acquisition he discussed with my husband last month." "Certainly, Mrs. Sterling. How does tomorrow at 10 work for you?" "Perfect." Madison ended the call and smiled for the first time in weeks. Derek Stone was Chase's biggest business rival, but he was about to become Madison's secret weapon. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean crashed against the private beach, the sound mixing with the distant hum of helicopters carrying other wealthy families to their weekend retreats. Madison had grown up in this world of privilege and power, but she had forgotten the most important lesson her father had taught her in business. As in war, the element of surprise was everything. She stood slowly, her pregnancy making quick movements difficult, and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water. Somewhere in Manhattan, Chase was probably taking that woman back to their penthouse apartment, the one Madison had decorated with love and care just 2 years ago. Tomorrow, she would begin dismantling everything he had built, using the very connections and resources he had dismissed as daddy's money. Chase Montgomery was about to learn that Madison Sterling had never been just a trophy wife. She was the daughter of media royalty, and she was ready to reclaim her throne. 3 weeks earlier, Madison had thought she was living in a fairy tale. She hummed softly while arranging white orchids in their Park Avenue penthouse, preparing for Chase's return from what he claimed was a business trip to Austin. The morning sickness had finally subsided, and she felt more like herself than she had in months. The elevator chimed, announcing Chase's arrival. Madison smoothed her silk maternity dress and walked toward the entryway, excitement bubbling in her chest. She had news to share. The doctor had confirmed they were having a girl. "Welcome home, stranger," she called out, but her voice died in her throat when she saw him. Chase stood frozen in the doorway, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled. Behind him, a young woman with platinum blonde hair and curves that defied physics was adjusting her crop top and checking her phone. "Oh," the woman said, looking up with striking blue eyes that held not a trace of shame. "You must be the wife." Madison felt the world tilt sideways. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "This is Skylar West," Chase said quickly, his voice strained. "She's a business consultant. We got caught in traffic from the airport, and I offered to let her freshen up before her meeting downtown." Skylar laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Business consultant, that's a new one, baby." The endearment hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Madison's hand moved instinctively to her belly, protecting the innocent life growing inside her from this moment of devastation. "I think you should leave," Madison said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "Oh, I'm going," Skylar said, slinging a designer purse over her shoulder. "But honey, you might want to check your husband's Tesla. I left something in there that belongs to me." She kissed Chase on the cheek before strutting to the elevator, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. The doors closed behind her, leaving husband and wife alone in the wreckage of their perfect life. "Madison, I can explain," Chase began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't. Just don't." She walked to the window, looking out at Central Park, where she had imagined pushing a stroller with their daughter just hours before. "How long?" "It's not what you think." "How long, Chase?" The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Finally, he spoke. 2 years. The number hit her like a physical blow. 2 years meant their entire marriage had been a lie. 2 years meant he had been with another woman when they decided to start a family. 2 years meant Madison had been living in a fantasy while her husband created a whole other life. "I need you to leave," she whispered. "This is my apartment too." Madison turned to face him, and Chase took a step backward at the expression in her eyes. "Get out. Now. Before I do something we'll both regret." After he left, Madison sat alone in the silence, processing the implosion of everything she had believed about her life. Then she remembered Skylar's parting words about the Tesla. The parking garage beneath their building was climate-controlled and pristine, home to Chase's collection of luxury vehicles. Madison rarely drove the Tesla, preferring the Mercedes he had bought her for their anniversary. But now she approached the sleek black car with the determination of a detective. The interior smelled like expensive perfume and betrayal. Madison searched methodically, her hands shaking as she opened compartments and checked under seats. In the glove box, wrapped in tissue paper like a grotesque gift, She found what Skylar had left behind: lace underwear. Red lace underwear that definitely didn't belong to Madison. She sat in the driver's seat, holding the evidence of her husband's infidelity, and felt something inside her break. Not her heart that had shattered upstairs when Skylar called Chase baby. This was something deeper. Her trust in the world, her belief in love, her faith that good things happen to good people. Madison pulled out her phone and called the one person who would understand. Brooklyn Hayes, attorney at law, came the familiar voice of her best friend since college. Brooke, I need a divorce lawyer. Madison, what happened? You sound terrible. I need the best divorce lawyer in New York, someone who destroys cheating husbands for a living. There was a pause. Honey, you're talking to her. I'll be right over. Madison ended the call and looked at herself in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, her carefully styled hair falling in disarray. She looked like exactly what she was, a pregnant woman whose world had just collapsed. But as she stared at her reflection, something else emerged. A hardness around her eyes that reminded her of her father during hostile takeover meetings. A set to her jaw that echoed her grandmother, who had built a media empire when women weren't supposed to own businesses. Madison Sterling Montgomery was done being a victim. It was time to remember who she really was. Brooklyn Hayes arrived at Madison's penthouse within the hour, armed with Chinese takeout, tissues, and the predatory instincts of a divorce attorney who specialized in taking down wealthy men. She took one look at Madison's tear-streaked face and immediately went into battle mode. Tell me everything, Brooklyn said, settling onto the white leather sofa that Madison had picked out with such hope just 3 years ago. And I mean everything. Don't leave out a single detail, because that detail might be what saves you in court. Madison recounted the afternoon's events, her voice growing stronger with each word. Brooklyn took notes on her iPad, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed just how carefully she was already building a case. The underwear is good evidence, but it's not enough, Brooklyn said finally. We need documentation, phone records, financial statements, proof of where he's been and what he's been spending money on. I have some of that already, Madison admitted, showing Brooklyn the evidence folder on her phone. Brooklyn scrolled through the screenshots with growing amazement. Girl, when did you become a private investigator? When I realized my husband was a stranger. Madison's voice was bitter. I started paying attention 3 months ago when he began working late every night. The stories never quite added up. Good instincts. But we need more. I'm going to recommend someone who can help us get the complete picture. Brooklyn made a phone call, speaking in low tones about surveillance and financial forensics. When she hung up, her expression was grimly satisfied. Marcus Chen is the best private investigator in the city, discreet, thorough, and he specializes in cheating spouses with complicated financial situations. He'll cost you, but based on what I know about Chase's net worth, you can afford it. Within 2 days, Marcus had compiled a dossier that made Madison physically sick. The evidence was overwhelming and devastating. Chase wasn't just having an affair, he was living a complete double life. Skylar West wasn't just some random Instagram influencer. She was Chase's kept woman, installed in a luxury apartment in Soho that he had purchased under a shell company. The monthly maintenance alone cost more than most people's annual salaries. The financial records revealed shopping sprees at Tiffany and Cartier, weekend trips to the Hamptons when Madison thought Chase was working, and deposits into Skylar's bank account that totaled nearly $2 million over 2 years. But the worst discovery came in the form of text message records that Marcus had somehow obtained. Madison sat in Brooklyn's office, her hands shaking as she read conversations between her husband and his mistress. She's getting so clingy since the pregnancy. Chase had written, always wanting to discuss baby names and nursery themes. It's suffocating. Skylar's response was equally heartless. Just tell her you're working late. We have that charity gala next week anyway. I already bought the perfect dress. Madison looked up from the phone screen, her face pale. They've been to public events together. While I was home with morning sickness, he was taking her to galas and premieres. Brooklyn reached across her desk and squeezed Madison's hand. I know this is painful, but this level of deception actually works in our favor. The courts don't look kindly on husbands who flaunt their affairs while their pregnant wives are at home. There's more, Marcus said quietly. He was a small, unassuming man who looked more like a librarian than someone who made his living exposing people's secrets. The shell company he used to buy Skylar's apartment, it's connected to several offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Madison felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of offshore accounts? The kind that suggest your husband has been hiding assets from you. And based on the timing of the transfers, he's been planning this for a while. Brooklyn leaned forward, her attorney instincts fully engaged. Planning what? I think he's been preparing to leave you, Marcus said gently. The asset transfers accelerated after you announced your pregnancy. He's been systematically moving money out of joint accounts and into places where you can't touch it. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Chase hadn't just been unfaithful, he had been preparing to abandon Madison and their unborn daughter while ensuring she would get as little as possible in the divorce. How much are we talking about? Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus consulted his notes. Conservative estimate. He's hidden approximately $50 million. Madison felt the baby kick, as if responding to her mother's spike in blood pressure. She placed both hands on her belly and made a silent promise to her daughter Chase Montgomery would not get away with this. What are our options? She asked Brooklyn. Legally, we can freeze his assets, demand full financial disclosure, and make sure you get what you're entitled to. But Madison... Brooklyn paused, choosing her words carefully. Men like Chase don't just roll over. He's going to fight dirty. Madison thought about the 2 years of lies, the millions of dollars spent on another woman, the casual cruelty of his text messages. A cold determination settled over her, familiar and welcome. It was the same feeling she had gotten as a child when her father explained hostile takeovers during dinner conversations. Good, Madison said finally. I learned how to fight dirty from the best. Brooklyn smiled for the first time since entering the case. Now you're talking like a sterling. Madison's first victory came sooner than expected. Armed with Marcus's evidence, Brooklyn filed an emergency motion to freeze Chase's assets while the investigation continued. The papers were served to Chase at his office on a Thursday afternoon in front of his entire executive team. Madison wasn't there to see his reaction, but Brooklyn's paralegal sent a gleeful text. Your husband's face just went through several shades of purple. His assistant asked if she should call an ambulance. The temporary restraining order prevented Chase from accessing any joint accounts or making major financial decisions without court approval. It was a surgical strike designed to get his attention, and it worked immediately. Madison was at home, reviewing fabric samples for the nursery she was determined to complete despite everything, when Chase burst through the front door without knocking. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, waving the legal papers like a weapon. Madison looked up from her swatches calmly. "Protecting my daughter's future. Something you should have thought about before spending her college fund on your girlfriend. Skylar isn't my girlfriend. She's a business associate." Is that what we're calling women who receive $2 million in gifts and rent-free luxury apartments? Chase's face went white. How did you find out about the money? The apartment, the offshore, accounts. Madison stood slowly, her pregnancy making quick movements impossible, but lending her a regal bearing that Chase seemed to notice for the first time. I hired professionals. Chase, real ones, not Instagram influencers pretending to be business consultants. You can't freeze my assets. That's my company. My money. Madison laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Actually, according to New York state law, any assets acquired during our marriage are community property, including the stock options you've been exercising and hiding in the Cayman Islands. Chase stared at her as if seeing a stranger. You're not this person, Madison. You're sweet and trusting and naive, stupid, easy to manipulate. Madison's voice turned deadly quiet. You're right. I was all of those things. But pregnancy has a way of clarifying priorities. She placed a hand on her belly. This little girl deserves better than a father who lies and steals from her family. So I'm going to make sure she gets it. Chase's phone buzzed with a text. He glanced at it and his face darkened further. Skylar wants to know why her credit cards aren't working. Oh, that, Madison said with mock surprise. I had Brooklyn freeze all the cards linked to your hidden accounts. Skylar will have to find someone else to fund her shopping addiction. You vindictive. Choose your next words very carefully. Madison interrupted. Because this conversation is being recorded for court purposes. She gestured to a small device on the coffee table that Chase had apparently missed. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Here's what's going to happen. Madison continued. You're going to move out of this apartment tonight. You're going to give me complete access to all financial records. And you're going to end whatever relationship you have with Skylar West. And if I don't, Madison smiled, and Chase actually took a step backward. Then I release the evidence we've compiled to the financial press. How do you think Montgomery Digital's stock price will react when investors learn their CEO has been embezzling company funds to support his mistress? That's not embezzlement. It's my money. Actually, using company resources for personal expenses is exactly embezzlement. The private jet flights to take Skylar to Aspen, the corporate credit card charges at jewelry stores, the company apartment you let her use for Instagram photo shoots. Madison ticked off each item on her fingers. Brooklyn estimates about $12 million in misappropriated funds. Chase sank into a chair, finally understanding the scope of Madison's counterattack. What do you want? Justice for me and for our daughter. Madison moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. But I'm willing to start with honesty. I never meant for it to happen this way, but it did happen this way. And now we both have to live with the consequences. That night, Chase moved his belongings to a hotel. Madison watched from the bedroom as he packed, noticing how many of his things she had never really looked at before. Designer clothes she had never seen him wear, cologne that smelled wrong on him, a phone charger that didn't match any device she knew about. After he left, Madison sat in the silence of the apartment that was now truly hers. The baby kicked restlessly, and she rubbed her belly soothingly. Don't worry, sweetheart, she whispered. Mommy's going to make sure you grow up in a world where people face consequences for their choices. Her phone rang. It was Brooklyn. How did it go? He's out, and Brooke set up that meeting with Derek Stone. I think it's time to move to phase 2. Derek Stone's office occupied the top 3 floors of a Manhattan skyscraper, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the city. Madison had been here once before, years ago, when Chase had brought her to a charity fundraiser that Derek was hosting. She remembered thinking that Derek looked like the kind of man who ate competitors for breakfast. Now, sitting across from him in his minimalist conference room, she hoped that predatory instinct would work in her favor. Derek was tall and imposing, with silver hair that suggested distinguished experience rather than age. His reputation in tech circles was legendary. He had built 3 companies from scratch and sold them for billions, always staying one step ahead of the market. "Mrs. Montgomery," he said, his voice carrying a slight Texas accent that he had never quite lost despite decades in New York. "I was intrigued by your call. Your husband and I don't exactly run in the same circles anymore." "That's precisely why I'm here," Madison replied. "I need someone who understands Chase's business methods but isn't bound by friendship or loyalty." Derek leaned back in his chair, studying her with intelligent gray eyes. "I assume this has to do with your recent marital difficulties. The tech community is smaller than most people realize." Madison wasn't surprised that he already knew about the asset freeze. News like that traveled fast in their rarefied circles. "I need an ally who can help me understand the full scope of what Chase has been hiding." "And what makes you think I'd be interested in helping you?" Madison reached into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. "Because I have information that might interest you about Montgomery Digital's upcoming acquisition strategy." Derek's eyebrows rose slightly. "I'm listening." "Chase has been using insider information to manipulate stock prices before major announcements. He's also been planning to acquire several companies using funds that legally belong to me." Madison slid the flash drive across the table. "Everything is documented on there." Derek picked up the drive but didn't insert it into his computer. "This is serious stuff, Mrs. Montgomery. You're talking about securities fraud. I'm talking about justice, and about making sure my daughter inherits something more than a criminal father's legacy." For a long moment, Derek said nothing. Then he smiled a slow, predatory expression that reminded Madison why he was so feared in business circles. "Your husband made a mistake 5 years ago," Derek said finally. "He stole my chief technology officer, along with proprietary code that belonged to my company. The lawsuit was settled quietly, but I never forgot." Madison felt a surge of hope. "So you'll help me." "I'll do more than that. I'll help you destroy him." Derek inserted the flash drive into his computer and began scrolling through files. "But I need to know you're serious about this. Taking down a billionaire isn't a game. Neither is abandoning your pregnant wife for an Instagram influencer." Madison's voice was steel. "I'm very serious, Mr. Stone." Derek nodded approvingly. "Call me Derek, and I think this is the beginning of a beautiful partnership." Over the next 2 hours, Derek explained the intricacies of corporate warfare in terms that Madison found surprisingly familiar. Her father had taught her the basics of business strategy, but Derek elevated it to an art form. "The key is to attack from multiple angles simultaneously," he explained, sketching diagrams on a whiteboard. "Financial, legal, and public relations. Chase's weakness is his ego. He believes he's untouchable." "What do you suggest?" "First, we accelerate the divorce proceedings. Your attorney is good, but I know someone better. Someone who specializes in high-net-worth divorces involving hidden assets." Madison thought of Brooklyn, who had been her closest friend since college. "I'm not abandoning my attorney. She's been with me from the beginning." "I'm not suggesting you abandon her. I'm suggesting you upgrade. Think of it as adding a specialist to your legal team." Derek made a phone call, speaking in low tones to someone named Catherine Walsh. When he hung up, he looked satisfied. "Catherine will meet with you tomorrow. She's the lawyer who took down the pharmaceutical executive who was hiding money in Swiss accounts. Cost him $3 billion in the settlement. And the second angle, we make Chase's business practices public. I have contacts at the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times. They love stories about tech billionaires behaving badly." Madison felt a twinge of conscience. Once information like this became public, there would be no taking it back. Chase's reputation would be destroyed forever. But then she thought about Skylar's red underwear in the Tesla, about the millions of dollars hidden in offshore accounts, about the text messages calling her clingy for wanting to discuss their daughter's future. "Do it," she said. Derek smiled again. "I was hoping you'd say that. The third angle is the most important. We need to make sure you're not just reacting to Chase's moves. You need to start making your own." "What do you mean?" "I mean, it's time for Madison Sterling to remember who she was before she became Madison Montgomery." Derek pulled up a new screen on his computer. "Your family's media company has been struggling since your father's death. What if it were to make a comeback?" Madison's breath caught. Sterling Media had been her father's life work, but after his death 3 years ago, she had been too overwhelmed with grief to take an active role. The company had been managed by a board of trustees, slowly losing market share to more aggressive competitors. "Are you suggesting I take over Sterling Media?" "I'm suggesting you use it as a weapon. Media companies have power that even tech billionaires respect, especially when they start investigating stories about corporate fraud and marital infidelity." Madison stared at the financial reports Derek had pulled up, seeing her father's company with new eyes. Sterling Media owned newspapers, television stations, and digital platforms across the country. In the right hands, it could be a formidable tool for justice. How would it work? Simple. You exercise your controlling interest and take your rightful place as CEO. Then Sterling Media breaks the story about Chase Montgomery's business practices. Simultaneously, your divorce attorney releases information about his personal conduct. Derek leaned forward, his eyes bright with anticipation. "By the time we're finished, Chase will be lucky to avoid federal prison, let alone win a divorce settlement." Madison placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby kick in response to her elevated heart rate. "When do we start?" "We already have. Welcome to the war. Madison Sterling." Madison's second victory came in the form of a front-page article in the Wall Street Journal exactly 1 week after her meeting with Derek Stone. The headline read, "Montgomery Digital under investigation for securities violations." And the accompanying photo showed Chase looking haggard as he left the federal building downtown. Madison read the article over breakfast in her penthouse, feeling a satisfaction that was both sweet and terrible. Every detail she had provided Derek was there, laid out in the clinical language of financial journalism. The stock manipulation, the misuse of company funds, the suspicious timing of major announcements, all of it presented with the kind of thoroughness that would make investors panic. Montgomery Digital's stock price had already dropped 18% in pre-market trading. Her phone rang. It was Chase, and his voice was nearly unrecognizable with rage. "You did this," he accused without preamble. "You fed them information about confidential business practices." "I provided documentation of illegal business practices," Madison corrected. "There's a difference. The SEC is launching a formal investigation. Do you understand what that means?" Madison sipped her decaf coffee thoughtfully. "It means you're going to have to explain where all that money really went. Should be interesting." "This will destroy me." "You destroyed yourself. I'm just making sure everyone knows about it." Chase's voice turned pleading. "Madison, please, we can work this out. We don't have to destroy each other." "I'm not destroying you. Chase, I'm protecting my daughter from a father who would steal her future to fund his mistress's lifestyle. Skylar is out of the picture. I ended it." Madison laughed bitterly. "Oh, did you? That's interesting, because according to my sources, she was photographed leaving your hotel room this morning." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Madison had learned to appreciate the power of good intelligence, and Marcus Chen was very good at his job. How did you? The same way I found out about everything else. You're not as careful as you think you are. Madison hung up and returned to her breakfast, but her satisfaction was short-lived. Within an hour, her phone was buzzing with calls from reporters who had somehow gotten her private number. By noon, there were photographers stationed outside her building. Brooklyn arrived with lunch and a grim expression. The story is everywhere. TMZ picked it up, which means it's going to be a circus. As if to prove her point, Brooklyn's phone rang. She answered and listened for several minutes before hanging up with a worried look. That was the courthouse. Chase's attorney has filed a counter motion claiming you're engaging in a malicious campaign to damage his reputation. They're asking for a gag order. Madison felt a chill of fear. Can they do that? They can try. But Catherine Walsh called this morning. She's taking over your case effective immediately. Derek Stone wasn't kidding when he said she was the best. Catherine Walsh turned out to be a petite woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the demeanor of a shark in an expensive suit. She met Madison at Brooklyn's office that afternoon, spreading documents across the conference table with military precision. I've reviewed your case, Catherine said without preamble. Your husband's attorneys are going to argue that you're using the media to pressure him into an unfavorable settlement. They're not wrong. Madison's heart sank. So they can stop the investigation. They can try to limit what information becomes public during the divorce proceedings. But here's the thing about federal investigations, they don't stop for family court judges. Catherine pulled out a tablet and showed Madison a series of news articles that had appeared since the Journal story broke. Forbes, Bloomberg, even Entertainment Tonight had picked up various aspects of the story. Your husband is learning what happens when you become a public figure, Catherine continued. Privacy becomes a luxury you can't afford. What about Skylar? She's been posting on Instagram like nothing happened. Catherine smiled coldly. Not for much longer. I've had my investigators looking into Ms. West's financial situation. Turns out she owes the IRS quite a bit in back taxes on all those gifts your husband gave her. Madison raised an eyebrow. Gift taxes. Any gift over $15,000 per year is supposed to be reported. Skylar received over $2 million in gifts and never reported any of it. The IRS gets very cranky about that kind of oversight. You reported her. I provided information to the appropriate authorities. What they do with it is their business. Madison felt a twinge of sympathy for Skylar, followed immediately by anger at herself for feeling sorry for the woman who had helped destroy her marriage. What happens now? Now we wait for Chase to make his next move. Men like your husband don't handle public humiliation well. He's going to do something stupid, and when he does, we'll be ready. Catherine's prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. That evening, Madison was having dinner with Brooklyn when her phone buzzed with a notification from Instagram. Someone had tagged her in a post. It was Skylar, looking perfectly made up despite the media circus surrounding her. The caption read, "Some women try to destroy successful men when they can't handle the competition, but karma is real, and the truth always comes out. Stay strong, wire real women. Shy your truth teller." Brooklyn read over Madison's shoulder and whistled low. She just made a huge mistake. How do you figure? She basically admitted to the relationship in writing, and she implied that you're lying about Chase's conduct. Brooklyn was already typing on her phone. Catherine needs to see this immediately. Within an hour, Catherine had filed a motion to include Skylar's social media posts as evidence in the divorce proceedings. The public nature of Skylar's defense made it impossible for Chase to claim the relationship was purely professional. But Madison barely noticed these legal victories. She was staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, seeing a woman she barely recognized. Her face was thinner despite the pregnancy, her eyes harder. her mouth set in lines that reminded her of her grandmother during corporate board meetings. The baby kicked, and Madison placed her hand on her belly. "I'm sorry you're seeing Mommy like this," she whispered. "But sometimes you have to fight for what's right." As she prepared for bed, Madison realized that tomorrow would mark exactly 1 month since she had discovered Chase's betrayal. In that time, she had frozen his assets, exposed his business crimes, and turned his public image into a cautionary tale about powerful men who thought they were above consequences. But she wasn't done yet. Phase 3 of Derek's plan was about to begin, and it would require Madison to step into a role she had been avoiding since her father's death. Tomorrow, she would walk into Sterling Media headquarters and reclaim her birthright. The quiet, trusting wife was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who understood that power wasn't given, it was taken. The Sterling Media building on 6th Avenue had been Madison's second home as a child. Her father used to bring her to work during school holidays, letting her sit in on editorial meetings and teaching her the difference between news and propaganda. Now, walking through the marble lobby for the first time in 3 years, Madison felt his presence like a guiding spirit. The elevator rose to the 40th floor, where the executive offices commanded a view of Midtown Manhattan. Madison's heels clicked authoritatively on the polished floors as she made her way to the corner office that had been her father's domain. The interim CEO, Harold Weinstein, was waiting for her with barely concealed hostility. He was a company veteran who had expected to be named permanent CEO after Richard Sterling's death, not to babysit the owner's grieving daughter. "Madison," he said, standing as she entered. "I was surprised to get your call. We weren't expecting you." "That's Ms. Sterling," Madison corrected, settling into the chair across from his desk with the regal bearing of someone born to power. "And this is my company, Harold. I don't need an invitation." Harold's face reddened slightly. "Of course. I just meant that we haven't seen much of you since your father passed. I assumed you were focused on your family." "My family is exactly why I'm here." Madison placed a folder on his desk. "I'm exercising my rights as majority shareholder, effective immediately. I'm assuming the role of CEO." Harold opened the folder and paled as he read the legal documents inside. "Madison, Ms. Sterling, this is very sudden. The board of directors hasn't even been consulted." "The board of directors works for me, not the other way around." Madison stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city her father had taught her to see as both a kingdom and a responsibility. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. I suggest you prepare your transition notes." Within 3 hours, Madison was sitting at the head of the polished mahogany table in Sterling Media's boardroom, facing 8 men and 2 women who had run her father's company in her absence. Some looked skeptical, others curious, but all of them recognized the determination in her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Madison began, her voice carrying the authority that came from owning 61% of the company's stock. "Sterling Media has been treading water for 3 years. Market share is down. Advertising revenue is declining. And our digital presence is a joke." Board member Patricia Collins, one of her father's oldest allies, leaned forward. "Madison, dear, we've been maintaining stability during a difficult period for the entire industry." Stability is another word for stagnation. Madison activated the presentation screen and pulled up a series of charts. "Our competitors have been innovating while we've been hibernating. That changes today." She clicked to the next slide, revealing a detailed business plan that she and Derek Stone had developed over the past week. "Sterling Media is going to become the premier investigative news organization in the country. We're going to break stories that matter, hold powerful people accountable, and remind the public why journalism is essential to democracy." Harold, who had been relegated to a corner chair, spoke up nervously. That kind of investigative reporting is expensive and risky. Powerful people fight back. Madison smiled, and several board members shifted uncomfortably. I'm counting on it. Our first major investigation will focus on corporate fraud in the tech industry, specifically the systematic hiding of assets by executives who use their companies as personal piggy banks. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Everyone in the room knew about Madison's divorce proceedings, and most had read about the federal investigation into Montgomery Digital. Patricia cleared her throat delicately. Madison, you're not suggesting we use company resources to pursue a personal vendetta. I'm suggesting we use company resources to pursue legitimate news stories that serve the public interest. Madison replied, If my personal situation led me to discover newsworthy information, that's what we call a tip. She clicked to the next slide, showing preliminary research that Marcus Chen had compiled on other tech executives with questionable business practices. Chase Montgomery isn't unique. There are dozens of executives hiding assets, manipulating stock prices, and using company funds for personal expenses. Sterling Media is going to expose all of them. Board member Thomas Wright, a conservative voice who had often clashed with her father, spoke up. This is a dangerous game. Madison, these men have resources and connections. They can destroy us in court. Let them try. Madison's voice was ice cold. Sterling Media owns newspapers in 12 states, 3 television stations, and digital platforms with millions of subscribers. When we tell a story, people listen. She pulled up the final slide of her presentation. I've already secured our first major scoop. Tomorrow morning, Sterling Media will break the story about Montgomery Digital's hidden offshore accounts. We have documents, recorded conversations, and financial records that show a pattern of systematic fraud going back 5 years. The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Madison let them talk for a moment before calling for quiet. I know this seems risky, she said, her voice softening slightly. But my father didn't build this company to play it safe. He built it to tell the truth, no matter how powerful the people who wanted that truth buried. Patricia nodded slowly. Richard would be proud of you. I hope so, because we're going to need his spirit in the coming months. Madison stood, signaling the end of the meeting. The new Sterling Media launches tomorrow. I suggest you all prepare for war. That evening, Madison sat in her father's office, now her office, reviewing the articles that would run in the morning. The lead story, written by Sterling Media's best investigative reporter, laid out the case against Chase with devastating precision, but Madison had added her own touch to the media blitz. In addition to the news coverage, Sterling Media's entertainment division would be producing a documentary about corporate fraud in the tech industry. The working title was The Billionaire's Wife, and it would feature exclusive interviews with Madison herself. Derek Stone called just after midnight. I've been monitoring the situation. Chase's attorneys have been making desperate phone calls all evening, trying to get someone to kill the story. Any luck? None whatsoever. Turns out owning your own media company has certain advantages. Madison smiled grimly. My father always said the pen was mightier than the sword. Your father was a smart man. Get some rest, Madison. Tomorrow is going to be a very interesting day. As Madison prepared to leave the office, she caught her reflection in the window overlooking the city. The woman staring back at her looked nothing like the naive wife who had arranged flowers just 6 weeks ago. This woman had the steel-eyed determination of someone who had learned that justice didn't happen by accident, it had to be created. She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's gentle movements. Tomorrow, sweetheart, the whole world is going to know that nobody messes with a Sterling woman. The war was about to reach a whole new level, The story broke at exactly 6 a.m. across every Sterling media platform simultaneously. The lead headline read, "The Montgomery Papers: How a Tech Billionaire Hid Millions While Betraying His Pregnant Wife." And it was accompanied by a photo of Chase and Skylar at a charity gala that had been taken while Madison was home with severe morning sickness. Madison watched the media explosion from her penthouse, monitoring social media feeds as the story spread across the internet like wildfire. Within 2 hours, Montgomery was trending on Twitter, and cable news networks were picking up the story for their morning broadcasts. But the real devastation was yet to come. At 9 a.m., Madison appeared on Sterling Media's flagship morning show for an exclusive interview. She had spent hours with a stylist and makeup artist, ensuring that she looked both vulnerable and powerful, a pregnant woman seeking justice, not revenge. "Madison Sterling Montgomery," the host began, "you've made serious allegations against your estranged husband. Tell us why you decided to speak out." Madison looked directly into the camera, her voice steady and clear. "My daughter deserves to know the truth about her father, not the public image he's cultivated, but the reality of who he is and what he's done. You're alleging that Chase Montgomery systematically hid assets and used company funds for personal expenses. That's a serious accusation." "It's not an accusation, it's a documented fact." Madison held up a thick folder. "I have bank records, credit card statements, and recorded conversations that prove everything we've published." The host leaned forward. "What was the most shocking discovery for you personally?" Madison paused, as if gathering courage to speak about painful memories. "Finding out that he had been planning to leave me since the day I announced my pregnancy. He started moving money offshore the same week we found out we were having a daughter." The interview continued for 20 minutes, with Madison presenting herself as a wronged woman seeking accountability rather than a calculating strategist orchestrating her husband's destruction. By the time it ended, public opinion had crystallized. Chase Montgomery was the villain, and Madison was the sympathetic victim fighting for her child's future. Chase's response was swift and catastrophic. At 11 a.m., he held an impromptu press conference outside Montgomery Digital's headquarters. Madison watched from her office at Sterling Media, surrounded by her newly assembled crisis management team. Chase looked terrible unshaven, exhausted, and clearly rattled. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, and his expensive suit couldn't hide the desperation in his eyes. "My wife is waging a campaign of character assassination," he began, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "She's using her family's media empire to destroy me because she can't accept that our marriage failed." The gathered reporters immediately began shouting questions about the financial evidence Sterling Media had published. Chase tried to maintain control, but his composure cracked when a reporter asked about Skylar West. "My personal relationships are not relevant to my ability to run Montgomery Digital," he snapped. "Madison is a bitter woman who can't handle the fact that I fell in love with someone else." Madison's PR director, a sharp woman named Elena Vasquez, actually laughed out loud. "Did he just admit to the affair on live television?" "He did more than that," Madison replied, watching Chase's face turn red as more questions flew at him. "He just made this personal when we had kept it professional." Chase's press conference deteriorated rapidly. When a reporter asked about the offshore accounts, he claimed they were standard business practices. When asked about using company funds for personal expenses, he said the amounts were negligible in the context of Montgomery Digital's overall revenue. But the fatal mistake came when a reporter asked if he had anything to say to his pregnant wife. "Madison made her choice when she decided to weaponize our personal problems," Chase said, his voice cold. "She chose war, and I'm going to finish it." The press conference ended with Chase storming back into his building, leaving behind a pack of reporters who immediately began calling legal experts to analyze his statements. Madison's phone rang almost immediately. It was Catherine Walsh, Did you see that? Catherine asked, her voice filled with amazement. Every word. He just handed us everything we need for the divorce settlement. Admitting to the affair, acknowledging the financial arrangements, threatening to finish the war with his pregnant wife. It's a prosecutor's dream. What about the federal investigation? Oh, that just got a lot more serious. The SEC doesn't like it when targets of their investigations give press conferences about standard business practices that are clearly illegal. Madison felt a moment of genuine pity for Chase. He had always been arrogant, but she had never seen him completely lose control like this. The man she had married would never have made such strategic errors. But the pity evaporated when her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. You have no idea what you've started. Madison showed the message to Elena, who immediately called Sterling Media's security director. Within an hour, Madison had a full protection detail and her penthouse was swept for surveillance devices. We're treating this as a credible threat, the security director explained. Mr. Montgomery has the resources to make life very difficult for you. That afternoon brought more disturbing news. Marcus Chen called with information about unusual activity around Madison's personal accounts. Someone's been trying to access your credit reports and banking information, he reported. Professional level stuff, not some random hacker. Chase. Or someone working for him. I've secured everything I can, but you need to be careful. Desperate billionaires play by different rules. Madison was beginning to understand that her war with Chase had entered a new phase. It was no longer about divorce settlements or public humiliation. It was about survival. That evening, as she sat in her fortified penthouse reviewing security protocols, Madison realized that she had underestimated her opponent. Chase might be facing financial ruin and federal investigation, but he was still a billionaire with powerful connections and very little left to lose. The baby kicked restlessly, responding to Madison's elevated stress levels. She rubbed her belly soothingly and made a silent promise whatever Chase was planning. She would be ready for it. Derek Stone had taught her that war required multiple strategies, but Madison was learning that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the one who had nothing left to lose. The attack came at dawn on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Chase's disastrous press conference. Madison woke to her phone buzzing incessantly with calls from reporters and attorneys. Elena Vasquez's voice was tight with controlled panic. Madison, you need to see the Wall Street Journal. Now. The headline made her blood run cold. Sterling Media CEO used company resources to wage personal vendetta against estranged husband. The article portrayed her as an unstable, vindictive woman who had inherited a media empire and was using it to destroy anyone who crossed her. It even questioned her fitness to be a mother, citing anonymous sources who expressed concern about her mental state during pregnancy. This is a hit piece, Madison told Elena. Every quote is anonymous. Every allegation is unsubstantiated. It doesn't matter. Sterling Media's shares are down 30%. At 10 a.m., her attorney delivered devastating news. Chase has filed an emergency motion claiming you're mentally unstable and unfit to have custody. He's asking for a psychiatric evaluation and supervised visitation only. Madison felt the walls closing in. Chase had found the nuclear option, questioning her fitness as a mother. But as she sat there, feeling the baby move restlessly, something crystallized in her mind. Chase had awakened something primal and powerful. Madison Sterling Montgomery was done playing defense. She called Derek Stone first. I need everything you have on Chase's psychological history, medical records, therapy sessions, prescription medications. Her next call was to Marcus Chen. I need you to investigate every person who provided information for that journal article. You have 6 hours. By afternoon, Madison had assembled a war room in Sterling Media's conference area. Marcus worked quietly in the corner, his screens displaying surveillance footage and phone records. The journal's source was Harold Weinstein, Marcus reported. He's been feeding information to Chase's people since you fired him. They paid him $200,000. Madison felt cold calculation override her anger. Bribery is a federal crime. She pulled up a presentation on the main screen. I've been in therapy since my father's death. Dr. Sarah Chen has been documenting my mental health throughout this ordeal. The next slide showed the psychiatrist's evaluation describing Madison's response as remarkably resilient and strategically sound. But we need more than defense, Derek said. Already handled. Madison clicked to reveal Chase's medical records. While Marcus investigated the leak, I had him look into Chase's psychological history. He's been seeing Dr. Rebecca Martinez for anger management and addiction to prescription stimulants. The room fell silent. Catherine Walsh looked up from her legal briefs. You're saying Chase has documented mental health issues? Narcissistic personality disorder with addiction components. He's been taking Adderall without a prescription. Dr. Martinez is concerned about his judgment and impulse control, especially after his threat to finish the war with his pregnant wife. Madison stood, placing her hands on the conference table. Tomorrow morning, Sterling Media publishes a special investigation into corporate executives who manipulate family court proceedings. The draft article detailed Chase's attempts to bribe journalists, hire investigators to harass his wife, and pressure federal judges through business connections. You have evidence of judicial pressure, Derek asked. Marcus found phone records showing Chase's attorney called Judge Harrison's chambers 17 times. Judge Harrison's son works for a Montgomery digital contractor. As the team dispersed to execute their assignments, Madison remained in the conference room, looking out at the city lights. The baby kicked gently, and she rubbed her belly while reviewing the final details. Chase had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed attacking her maternal fitness would break her spirit. Instead, it awakened the protective fury of a mother defending her child's future. Tomorrow, Chase Montgomery would learn the difference between a desperate businessman and a sterling woman protecting her family. The phoenix was about to rise from the ashes, and she intended to burn down everything that had tried to destroy her. The courtroom was packed with reporters and spectators who had followed the Montgomery divorce case through its spectacular public evolution. Madison sat at the plaintiff's table, 8 months pregnant and radiating quiet confidence. Across the aisle, Chase looked like a man who had aged years and months. Judge Patricia Reeves, who had replaced Judge Harrison after his recusal due to potential conflicts of interest, called the hearing to order. Madison's investigation had exposed the connection between Harrison's family and Montgomery Digital. Catherine Walsh stood for Madison's opening statement. Your Honor, this case is about holding powerful men accountable when they abuse their wealth to manipulate both the justice system and their families. The evidence unfolded like a masterclass in corporate crime. Hidden offshore accounts totaling $87 million, systematic misuse of company funds, stock manipulation that defrauded investors, and most damning, documented attempts to bribe journalists and pressure federal judges. Madison watched Chase's face as each piece of evidence was presented. The arrogant billionaire who had dismissed her as clingy was now a broken man facing federal prison. Derek Stone's testimony was surgical in its precision, detailing Chase's theft of proprietary technology, stock manipulation, and use of shell companies to hide assets. The custody hearing was devastating for Chase. Dr. Sarah Chen testified about Madison's excellent mental health. Dr. Rebecca Martinez detailed Chase's psychological issues and addiction problems. But the knockout blow came from Skylar West. Facing her own legal troubles, she had decided loyalty to Chase wasn't worth federal prison time. Chase told me he was planning to leave Madison after the baby was born, Schuyler testified. He said pregnant women were too emotional to think clearly, and he could use that against her in court. Madison felt the baby kick sharply and placed a protective hand on her belly. Schuyler continued with details that made the court reporter wince. Chase had recorded private conversations with Madison, hired investigators to follow her, even discussed having her committed to a psychiatric facility. He said rich men don't lose custody battles, Schuyler concluded. He said he would make sure Madison never saw her daughter. Judge Reeves recessed briefly, then returned with her decision. In 20 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such clear evidence of fraud, manipulation, and abuse of power. Mr. Montgomery's actions represent betrayal of his marriage vows, fiduciary duties, and responsibilities as a father. Madison held her breath. Mrs. Montgomery is awarded full custody, with Mr. Montgomery's visitation rights supervised and contingent upon court-mandated counseling regarding assets. Mrs. Montgomery is awarded 75% of all marital property, including recovery of offshore funds. Madison felt tears of relief. Her daughter would be safe and financially secure. Additionally, this court is referring all evidence of criminal conduct to federal authorities. As the courtroom erupted in chatter, Chase walked slowly toward Madison's table. Madison, he said quietly, I'm sorry for everything. Madison looked up at the man she had once loved, seeing not the powerful billionaire, but a broken human being who had destroyed his own life. I'm sorry too, Chase, she replied. Sorry that our daughter will grow up knowing what kind of man her father really is. 6 weeks later, Madison gave birth to Phoenix Sterling Montgomery. Derek Stone and Brooklyn Hayes were among the first visitors to the new mother and her perfectly healthy daughter. Any word from Chase? Brooklyn asked as Madison nursed the baby. He's plea bargaining with federal prosecutors. 3 to 5 years in minimum security. Madison looked down at her daughter's perfect face and felt peace she hadn't known in months. Phoenix won't have to worry about that. Her inheritance will be built on truth and justice. Sterling Media had flourished under Madison's leadership, becoming the premier investigative news organization in the country, launching exposés that led to dozens of federal investigations. As her visitors left, Madison sat alone with Phoenix, watching the sunset over Manhattan. The baby's eyes already showed hints of sterling intelligence. You're going to change the world, little one, Madison whispered. But first, Mommy's going to make sure it's a world worth changing. The millionaire who had taken his mistress to Fashion Week was now a federal prisoner. The woman he had underestimated was now one of America's most powerful media executives. And their daughter would grow up knowing that justice required more than hope. It required a mother's love and a sterling woman's determination. The phoenix had risen from the ashes of betrayal, more magnificent than anyone could have imagined. If this story of ultimate comeback left you speechless, smash that like button and tell us in the comments, what would you do if you discovered your partner's betrayal? Share this with someone who needs to hear that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we're just getting started with stories that'll make you believe in justice again.